this motion which stands in consent hearing.
Honorable Chair, Nasser and I are very, very clear. We believe that when an individual turns 18, despite what that person might think, their connection and their duty to care to their parent is not gone. We believe that this debate is of course not about tight-knit families like mine, for example, that I will as is pay money to my parents when I become 19 past that. We're mainly talking about parents and families specifically that are distant, or families that are very selfish and that are not likely to do this particular motion when we don't have it on the status quo. A couple of things that I want to do before going into any arguments. Let's take a look at our model. Of course, under the info slide, we're assuming that this particular individual has not been abused or neglected, and that therefore they would have the legal duty to pay some certain amount of money to the parents that they have. But we think that, of course, we're going to be allowing these particular people to pay this payment proportional to their socioeconomic class and their income, right? For example, we're not going to have a flat rate of how much money you have to give to that particular parent. We think it's going to be mixed along with your income as well as just what the basic needs for that parent are in terms of things like medical needs. We're talking about living needs. Of course, we're talking about things that are not like lump sum cash payments so that that individual can gamble or do bad things. That's not what we're talking about. It actually has to go into an institution and provide that benefit. Moreover, though, we think you have to make that transaction. You have to have a proof of payment. This could either be proven through audits or it could be proven through your end-of-year bill assessments when you hand in your bills. Fourthly, if you had an absentee father or if you had an absentee mother, we're not going to require you to pay any sort of money towards that particular individual, especially if spousal control is already established towards one parent. And finally, if you don't abide to this model, we think fines are something that we're absolutely looking forward to, even more than the actual amount of money you would initially have required to pay. Three arguments. First of all, duty of care. Secondly, the parent-child relationship. I'll take in a second. And then finally, in terms of the burden on elderly services. Go for it.
If those parents are wealthy enough to care for themselves, there is no longer that duty that exists upon those children?
No, that's not a clarification. But I actually, in many cases, think that there is still that duty. This is going to be for all parents. And we particularly think that even if you are well off, we particularly think that elderly individuals, in many cases, do have needs that surpass a lot of things more than simply money. First of all, duty of care. 3 subpoints. We firstly think in many regards that there exists a duty of care between a child and a parent. Parents paid in many cases for your school. They gave you shelter, they put food on the table, they incurred debt, and they worked long hours in many cases. We don't think, of course, that money is the only way to symbolize love or to symbolize attachment in any way. But we do realize that there are unique circumstances that elderly individuals face later when they're incapable of working, when they're incapable of bringing more money to their family, and that's something that we think we need to recognize. No thank you. But second of all, what we're doing is basically flipping the paradigm of what's already an expectation on parents, right? When you are a parent, you have the expectation to provide for your child. Because at that particular moment, your child is the most vulnerable actor in that particular family. When that child grows up, the individual in that family that becomes the most vulnerable is the elderly parent. So we are flipping that paradigm that already exists in the status quo and providing for elderly individuals. Because in many cases, as I said, we have specific barriers that face them from being able to tap into services, and even when they want to do that through the state, these services tend to be very, very bad. No thank you. Third of all, though, we think even if there are practical harms to this particular motion, we think on a very principle level, this is a good norm that we should push towards society. At the point where we understand that yes, attachment can come in different forms, but attachment nonetheless must exist between a child and their parent. Why is that important? Second argument on the parent-child relationship. 3 subpoints under this as well, but go for it.
If this is what you support, do you also support me changing diapers for my parents as a mandatory thing? Or me going to quit my job to move to another city if this doesn't exist, if this is something which, because the parents have taken care of me, why should I not do these things as well?
I think there are dire needs that certain parents have and that we should cover those particular costs. Of course, we're paying for services where you're able to get people to do things like change your diapers or whatever it is, right? In many cases, what I would say is we're particularly trying to pay, especially for the parents that are incapable of paying that on their own. But yes, if there are parents that are able to be very well off, I still think this is a benefit at the point where that attachment between that child and that parent is solidified, is still there in many regards. But first of all, under this argument, we think there are tangible benefits, specifically to the families I outlined at the start of the speech, right? Look, even if you don't ever talk to your parent, and of course you're not being neglected or abused, there are still benefits towards giving this particular money. It doesn't make things hostile, but moreover, it's better than the comparative, where that relationship was non-existent on any level whatsoever, not even on a monetary level. In many regards, we think if you're a selfish parent, when you become a future parent, or if you are currently a parent, you have all the more incentive to never neglect or even abuse your child. Because of the fact that if we have parents that care so much about themselves, in many cases we think they'd likely not take that first step towards neglecting or abusing their child because they know that it might come back to bite them. But finally, for future parents, we think it is critically important for them to understand the significance of that bond that can persist even after 18, even after you send your child out of the door to go and live on their own. Final argument on how it's a less burden for elderly services. And this is where I want to critically point out how shitty elderly services actually are. We think the state has failed in being able to provide infrastructure and being able to provide basic resources to elders to be able to live their life. These particularly harm, most of all, people from a lower socioeconomic class, wherein on the comparative, opposition would never be able to provide for those parents unless they use our mechanism as a supplementary way for them to be able to actually gain access to healthcare, for them to be able to gain access to services, like even paying for elder homes, and trying to be able to get the state to not have to funnel so much money towards spreading it so thin that each of those elder homes get even worse and worse because the state can't divert its resources to places that are very concentrated. So for all of those reasons, because we think that there exists a duty of care between a child and a parent, because we think that there are incentives now for the particular parents we're talking about in this resolution, selfish parents, for example, to not neglect or abuse their child, and because we think this is generally a good norm to push down within society, we're very proud to propose. Thanks a lot.
I think the speaker's for his remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to deliver his 7-minute address here. Oh, her 7-minute address, sorry.
Honorable panel, there are certain moral risks and hazards that always come with bearing a child. Recognize that by bearing a child, you impose upon that child, without that child's consent, all the future suffering that will accrue upon that child, regardless of what your good intentions may have been. And that is something I think that opening government doesn't recognize when they say that a parent always does good things for the child. We, on the other hand, think that on principle, a parent does good things for the child as a way to recompensate the child for all the sufferings implicated on it. And that's going to be the bulk of my case. I want to talk to you about that, and then I want to talk to you about property rights and why a child's relationship to its parent is never always the most significant in its life. And last of all, I want to talk about what fixes the social welfare system. The answer is not OG's case. But before that, I just want to have a quick rebuttal against what Switch said, right? He said, this at least means an incentive to not abuse or neglect your child in the future. Okay, I think that this will prove a tipping point for very few of the parents that do currently abuse or neglect their children. I think it is very unlikely that it will look 60 years into the future and be like, yes, this child will one day provide for me. I guess I might not in a fit of rage hit this child. I honestly think that if you abuse your child in a fit of rage, this is unlikely to change your calculus very much. But even beyond that, even if we were to buy, it's a tipping point for some of the parents, which, okay, I'm going to give them. I think it's probably bad to position your child as a future cash cow that can always be milked for you. I think it's probably bad to commodify your child in terms of what your child can do for you, rather than why you had that child, which would prefer to be recognizing that you have a child, and when you have that child, it becomes an autonomous human being that you do not own. It is a being of its own, and I think that's crucially important. What do we stand for on our side? I think we'd be happy for reasonable alternatives, right? I think we'll be happy with propping up the state welfare system, and I'm going to show you how we actually get there. I think it's morally praiseworthy what they're suggesting on their side, but it's in no ways morally obligatory.
Here.
Yeah.
Your principal stance is against parents raising their child as cash cows, for example. That will already exist on your side at the point where parents have the expectation on their side and our side that children will, when they grow up, pay for them and actually support them.
I think the expectation actually exists on your side because you're the one supporting filial piety laws. But even beyond them, I think that maybe the expectation does exist in certain senses. At least we're not codifying it. I think when you codify something legally, you are setting the norm that the government actually enforces this and expects you to do your duty, even though we don't think that duty exists in many cases. First of all, on moral obligations and moral hazards. I think because children didn't ask to be born, there is a corresponding lack of choice given to them in how they choose to live their life. I think parents actually dictate a lot of what happens to you when you're born later. I think it means they make holistic choices for you about what kinds of religion you're brought up in, completely excluding Arlen from ever doing things like eating pork, which should very much benefit him in his future livelihood. I think it also restricts his choices of future marriages because he's not allowed to date outside his religion. I think that these are all things that, even though they may sound trivial, completely diminish the number of choices a child is given. What else? When you give a child birth without its consent, you means that its socioeconomic status is in many cases dictated by the family it's born into. In many cases, the arbitrary characteristic of its race dictates how it's able to live its life. I think these are all things that children are not able to consent to, and in many cases have detrimental effects upon their lives. Why is this important? Firstly, because it's highly coercive. You as a child can never opt out of the system for very obvious biological reasons. But second of all, insofar as you are born, the parents have imposed all the potential risks of life upon you, and therefore owe you an obligation in return for all the emotional love and joy they gain from it, right? Like, presumably, there is a benefit to a parent from procreating that isn't always just economic. In this particular case, we think that a parent showering affection and money upon a child is just recompense for imposing all these harms upon the child. I think parents also benefit massively emotionally from having a child, so it's not fair to say a child's only duty is to, like, reciprocate in terms of money, right? And I think the cost of raising a child also means that you are choosing to raise a child in this instance when OG says you should always raise a child to, like, cash cow you back in the future. It's just a very bad decision to have a child. Even if all that doesn't stand, I think it's really terrible to enshrine biological love and biological parenthood as the sole deciding factor about what a parent and child should consider in terms of deciding what's important to them. And that's going to be my second point. I think there is a strong narrative in today's society that biological love, and indeed love, is something that can never be modified. When we look at things like other strong emotions, things like extreme sadness which return depression, or extreme other kinds of emotions that cause mood swings, we are perfectly fine with treating them sometimes as medical conditions or sometimes as rearranging them. But we have this narrative that love is the only thing that cannot be touched, and I think that's coming into play here when you say that a biological love or a biological bond between a parent and a child is the only thing that must be noted. Why is this really, really important? Because I think while it's morally good if you pay somebody back, it's never going to be morally obligatory unless the government bench can show that in every case you should and do have a duty to pay your parent back regardless of what kind of feelings you hold towards them, regardless of what kinds of resentment you hold towards them, regardless of whether or not you're in a distant family where you often feel that your parents have done very little or nothing for you, and especially in cases where you believe that other people have done more for you than your parent has ever done. Why is this really important? Give me a sec. It's really important because it means you're saying that a parent, just by virtue of having given birth to you, is automatically tied to you and shackled to you for life, regardless of whatever benefits you may or may not have gained. Back half.
If you really hate and regret your existence, you actually can opt out of it at any point, right? The fact that you're not makes it a bit unreasonable to say that you're blaming someone else for the fact that you exist.
I honestly think it is fairly unreasonable to ask a person to opt out of their existence by committing suicide just as a protest against filial piety laws. I think most people will probably not opt for that choice because even though they regret their parents' existence in their lives, they probably don't regret every single aspect of their lives. I'm telling you, that parents do harm to certain aspects of your life. That doesn't mean you should opt out of your life entirely. Of course, if that's what like CG wants to argue, props to them, I guess. Okay, property rights, and why is this important? Because things about property means that you and your labor created whatever money you're going to eventually donate back to your parents. And I think the state actually plays a pretty large role in doing so, or other guardian figures in your life play a pretty large role in doing so. I don't think it's fair to say that just by virtue of having given birth to you, a parent is not automatically entitled to the next 50 years of your well-being as you continuously pay them back for what they may or may not have done. What fixes the welfare system on our side? I think the government pushing responsibility onto the individual hides the role of political, economic, and social structures that exist today. I think the societal belief right now is that an individual is meant to change themselves to fit society rather than society changing itself to help the individuals. The assumption and narrative here is that an individual is always responsible for, the individual is always responsible for taking care care of their parents, but since government structures are probably responsible for the parent having to like financially depend on the child anyway, I think the government should probably take some of the burden onto them. I think you decrease that burden when you're able to say it's the child's responsibility to do it instead. I think this absolves the government of their guilt, that leaves them an easy way out to not fix the social welfare systems, and pushes the burden on a child who never consented in the first place. I am very proud to oppose.
I thank the Speaker for her remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to resume the defence of Side Government's case. Here.
Honourable Speaker, two areas of clash that I'm going to focus on in my speech today. Firstly, about this idea of the duty of care and the dynamics of the family unit, and secondly, about the idea of social services, something that we don't think opposition even really touched in their opening address. So firstly, about this duty for care, and what we saw from both Swish and the Leader of the Opposition. So what we saw from them in response to Swish's arguments for saying that parents are the lifetime givers, the lifetime providers and caregivers for these children, thus the child owes them something in return. They simply said that this is in order to compensate for the fact that a child never consented to being born in the first place. While we're willing to swallow that no one can really consent to being born, what we can say is that parents can go above and beyond in ensuring that children are given the best life possible, right? We think to the extent that parents are able to do that for their child, instead of forcing the child to be able to do that on their own, we think there's a huge difference, right? And that parents who are neglectful, parents who are abusive, shouldn't be held to the same account as parents who have necessarily gone above and beyond to care for their child. But more importantly, this is necessarily a question of how we want our society to be structured, right? About even if we're willing to swallow the blame that we can't necessarily assure consent in this situation, why we value a family unit as a basic form of governance in our society. The reason for that being, Honourable Speaker, is because of the fact that the state can't provide a way to evenly distribute and evenly determine what is necessarily the best life for that child. That's why we defer to things like parental autonomy. Because of the fact that we can rely on individuals to be able to, first of all, have some sort of necessarily partial connection to that child, and is necessarily going to feel some degree of affection, thus they care for them their entire life, etc., etc. But more importantly, what we say is that our state needs to be able to function in a way that when we have the family as the basic unit of our governance, in a way, what that necessarily means is that the people who should be in charge, the people who should care for others in that situation, should be the ones who are the most capable, right? So when it comes to a parent-child relationship, we think that the parent necessarily has that autonomy and has a duty to care for the child because the child simply isn't able to do all these things for themselves, to provide for themselves, to work for themselves, to do anything really. So we think that at the point where a parent is no longer capable of doing that for themselves, the child necessarily has a duty in order to provide that and wherein they can't provide that, we think only in that situation should a state necessarily intervene. But then they talked about this idea about how it's necessarily bad to commodify a child as someone who's going to provide for you. We don't think that that's necessarily the case, because if they want to rely on the status quo, children just loving their parents enough to be able to do this for them, because we still haven't seen a mechanism, an alternative to show why social services are improved on their side of the house. What we necessarily see is that that's sort of an aspect of being a parent anyway, right? You're still going to have that. The reason you provide your child with so much love and support and try and guide them in their ambitions and everything is because you want them to be as successful as possible, right? It might seem necessarily selfish, but you are also at the same time trying to provide the best form of life to your child. But more importantly, what we say is that the sentiment behind this necessarily of providing to your parents in their old age is that isn't necessarily that love is being suddenly codified and no longer has any meaning, right? Like the sentiment behind it still exists. That you're not just paying that it's not just paying a lump sum to some random entity and that's the end of the line, right? You're paying for that parent. You're paying for that parent to be cared for, to be given the best medical service possible, to ensure that they can continue living, to make sure that they have a roof over their head.
Exactly.
We think that these are necessarily ways in which we can display affection and love and care for someone, so it necessarily can be codified in that way. Sure.
Alright, so what incentive does the state ever have to improve at the point when all responsibility for the state is pushed onto the individual child, despite the fact that the individual child didn't create the social structures that impoverish the parents?
But the other thing that first of all, we don't see necessarily how the state can improve the resources being necessarily spread too thin. But more importantly, we don't even think that the state can improve in a way that's going to be tangible, right? Like, if this is the case, why wouldn't we say, at the same time you're saying that the state can simply care for all parents in their old age, why shouldn't the state necessarily just care for all children once they come into the world? world, right? Because A, we necessarily see that parents have a right to be able to determine what is best for them. The state is incapable of doing that. But moreover, that we see a less capacity for like abuse and greater capacity to care for that child more specifically. And the same goes with the parent, right? Like the reason that we have like foster care as like a safety net is and like as a last resort is because of the fact that the system is really shitty, right? No matter how much effort and no matter how much political capital tries to go into fixing that system, we aren't going to defer to that as a base resort. We want to be able to ensure that parents are going to take some sort of legal responsibility and autonomy over their children. We think the same thing goes for parental authority, right? For caring for parents in their old age. Because what we think is that even if you like didn't have the best relationship with your parents, you aren't necessarily going to, at least in the significant majority of cases where there isn't neglect and abuse, they're going to necessarily care for their parent, and when they're providing this money, might as well see that it is going towards good use, and might actually work towards improving the relationship with that parent. A norm that Swish talked about that we actually do want to improve upon, that was never really dealt with on opposition today. But moreover, we say is that so when you do defer to the system defer to the government, you're necessarily going to have a greater capacity for at least at best like no affection, no care for that parent. They're just put into a home and hope that like the depression rates that are going up for elderly people disappear. But more importantly, what we see is like you have a rising case of like elderly abuse of these victims, turning them into victims because of the fact that someone who works a shitty government job isn't necessarily and like is underpaid isn't going to necessarily care for a parent in the same way that someone who like their mother had to undergo 33 hours of labor for them. Like you're necessarily going to have a greater connection to them, something that side opposition just doesn't take into account. So no matter how much they hope that the system can be improved, it isn't necessarily going to be done under their system. Actually, yeah, I'll say
Let's say that I earn the minimum wage and my mom has cancer. I don't have enough money to pay for treatment. It is obviously going to make her life better if I'm going to quit my job and help her as a guardian. Should the state compel me to do it? And if not, where the line goes?
No, because what we already told you is that it's going to be proportional to what you are capable of, right? Like just as a parent who is incapable of caring for their child to the necessary degree that we expect of them is going to they like lose authority over that child and no longer have the burden placed upon them. Similarly, like if you come from a poor background, you simply can't provide for your parent. That obligation isn't going to fall on you. We still want to have the state as a safety valve in the most extreme situations, and sure we want to make efforts towards improving that, but we certainly don't want that to be the first resort because we think that we are now entering an age where elderly people are becoming greater victims of like a lack of affection, of a lack of care, of a lack of treatment, being a huge capacity for abuse towards them. Something that side opposition wants to simply scapegoat by saying that, well, against the will of this unborn child, they brought them into the world, so they had it coming, right? We don't think that that's necessarily the binary that has to exist. We don't think that they're necessarily imparting such a great deal of suffering, especially if we're taking away the cases in which abuse and neglect come into play. So what have we shown you so far today? We've shown you that both the duty to care for a parent and the familial dynamics that exist implore us to think principally that this is the best case, but also the fact that it burdens social services to a great degree is for these reasons that this resolution must pass. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for remarks and call upon the deputy to conclude the front half of this round of debate. Here.
Speaker, the reality we have to address on both sides of the House are people are self-rational actors who make cost-calculating decisions. Opening Gov accepts this, thus they have to accept the fact the norm that you suddenly create a better connection with their parents just because you forced to pay for them is likely actually going to fall on our side of the House. Because when you view someone as a leech, when you view someone as taking necessary resources you need, you probably are more likely to view those parents in a negative light. You're less likely to give the parents the very emotional services that opening government wants so much. We think it's better on our side of the House to set a coercive norm that tells you necessarily have an obligation, but one that you as an actor can decide that parent has been a meaningful actor in assisting you in your growth. One point of extension in this speech, elaborating on Enting's argument about how this actually pushes the obligation upon individuals rather than the state. Before I do that, though, 3 points of refutation over here out of opening government. First of all, they say, look, parents cared for you, thus you owe them the obligation to return that favor. First of all, recognize the fact that if they're going to rely on the idea that you as a child was vulnerable, you also have to recognize the reason you were vulnerable is because the parents decided to have you in that condition and put you in that state. The reason that parents have that obligation is because they brought you into that world. That being said, you as a child in no way contributed contributed to their old age, and in no way to their impoverished condition. In the way that that parent may be rich and no longer needs that actual duty and support from that child, we think in that way that that child is exempt from that duty. This is why I asked that clarification at the beginning of that debate. But now, all of a sudden, if that parent is like ill or was unable to save properly for themselves, it's unclear to us that child is in any way meaningfully responsible, should now be forced to actually shoulder that burden. Thus, you can choose if you actually want to help that child, if you see that, or help that parent, that is something that you want to do. We think it's unreasonable to actually, and overreaching to tell that child they now have to take on that burden. Why? Because first of all, we think that parents choose to have children not because they see them as being an economic resource 50 years in the future, right? It's probably a pretty bad economic decision. Instead, they do so because it's an emotional benefit, and most people see having a child as a successful emotional part of their life. Insofar as a child serves that purpose, we think then telling that child they have to secondarily fulfill another obligation, even though they never chose to opt into that obligation, never consented to that obligation, at the age of 18 never asked to consent to the obligation, is probably an unmeaningful decision and probably not a fair thing to do, right? Parents recognize the fact that they have that child, have to provide for them. Children are never given that same exact choice. Secondarily, recognize the fact that if you want to hinge your case on the fact of saying parents are responsible for your success, that is not a meaningful argument in itself. Recognize the fact that some parents may actually be less efficacious in that child's life in helping their development as compared to an uncle, an aunt, a teacher, a counselor. We say in the same way if that person is really meaningful in their development, why does that same obligation and duty not exist then to help that person who may have been equally meaningful, if not more meaningful in your upbringing? They have to do more than point to an arbitrary connection that I was born to a family and I have some sort of meaningful connection, which we don't think is in any way actually an important one. No, thank you. Also recognize the fact that not all parents will be perfect. Opening government even concedes this, right? Because the best of children likely will offer this familial aid to their parents. But the fact of the matter is, most of the children who aren't are like ones who view their children as being coercive actors. See, the ones who feel like their entire religious, cultural identity or career choices are dictated to them by their parents. We think while those parents may not be technically negligent or abusive, that parent may have actually adversely affected your growth, right? In that case then, stating that you now have, as an individual, have an obligation to pay back that parent who has actively screwed over your life is unfair and creates an unreasonable infringement upon that child's autonomy. In that case that happens, we think it's better if that child themselves decides if they want to help that parent. Why is that? Because most children actually choose to help out their parents if that parent was actually meaningful in their life. I mean, he literally says this at the beginning of his PM speech, right? He says, like, my parents are important to me, I want to help them. Because we do have a connection to people who help us. We oftentimes do want to help people who have been a significant part of our life. But in the case that parent has not been significantly helpful, and if somebody has been adversarial, we think telling all children they have some actual obligation to give you some amount of their money is probably not a fair thing to tell those children. Go.
And he characterizes these people as people who think their parents did nothing for them, obviously wishing that they did more. Isn't this then a first step towards building a relationship that could exist in the future?
Okay. Or you tend to view someone who has actually robbed you of all of your autonomy, now you have to pay them money, you're probably more likely to view them in a negative light, right? In the case that maybe some child is likely to come to a reckoning and realizing, hey, maybe that parent is actually beneficial to me, that probably happens when they don't view them as a lease that is taking all their money, but instead someone, as they see them get older, they actually decide, maybe I should go visit my parents. Maybe there's someone actually meaningful to me, right? In the case, we don't actually even have to prove that burden, because that parent isn't important to us. We don't see why that as a impact is any bigger than all the reasons we're telling you, that if the kid never actually comes to that realization, putting a massive obligation upon that child is not actually very helpful, and we think that's significantly outweighed by all the arguments that we brought to you. Secondly, they say, look, you create better future parents as you're more likely to appreciate them. We've already told you you're likely to view them as elites. We think also, if we see people as perfectly rational, cost-calculating actors, they actually are probably less likely to care for their children in the future, because they're less likely to see returns off that, right? If I know I can treat my child like shit without abusing them and treating them negligently, but they'll actually give me money later in the future, why the heck would I ever care to improve the actual quality of care I give to that child? It's probably just more likely that I'm likely to improve my quality of care for that child if I want them to take care of me in the old age, because then I actually see that as a benefit and something that's likely to happen. Lastly, they tell you the state has failed. This is where the constructive comes in. So first of all, recognize the fact that some children will step in, right? We don't have to completely tell you the state has to protect every single child ever, or every single parent ever. But also recognize the fact that the state consensually takes your labor and now owes you, right? Because you have contributed to that society in some meaningful way, and that the state understood what it was doing. Thus, if that's the case, we think the state is a better actor to step in than those children. Why? Because we think when you put the responsibility onto an individual, on the individual of that child, it hides the role of the political, economic, and social structures that have put you in that position of being elderly, not having welfare support in the first place. Recognize the fact that when you don't have access to vouchers, when you don't have access to medication, that is a failure of the state to not provide for you, right? The fact that other elderly people at a younger age were able to get massive resources and assistance to not be in their condition of poverty shows that you, as a parent, are not in that position because your child doesn't provide for you, but instead it's because that state hasn't actually come out and helped you, right? So Therefore, we think once you put that onus on the individual, it does two things. First, it absolves the state of the very responsibility it should have upon those people. Opening government themselves say this in their speech. The state has failed you. We think absolving the responsibility and saying someone else has to step in who has no actual obligation to that person is actually probably unfair. But secondly, you as a state that never actually have to fix those problems that are present within society. When you recognize that a child may actually step in and buy the medication, you never actually have to offer voucher programs. That means, first of all, parents who never actually have children are out fucked because now they can't actually turn to children who are going to help them. But secondly, those who do have children who are poor and can't afford giving their parents very much money, the very POI the closing opposition asked, right? We extend that by telling you that if I don't have enough money to pay for my parent's cancer, then that parent is screwed and never will actually be able to afford actual treatment for that cancer. We think that insofar as the state's failed, we think that that's quite bad. Lastly, they say, well, look, a resentful child will be better than an employee. Why is that the case? If I'm a resentful child, I'm going to give my money and I'm never going to visit that parent again. In that way, the employee is giving me the exact same money. Why is it any better then? We think an employee can do just as good of a job if they actually give some degree of money and actually help that parent. We don't think there's ever any mechanism drawn there. Look, the point of the matter of this debate is that we think, first of all, the state does a better job sometimes of coming in cases where that child is provided, but secondly, we think that children don't have some sort of arbitrary connection that justifies them having to make massive sacrifices. For those reasons, incredibly proud of us.
I think Speaker for his remarks and call upon the member of government to extend the case of side proposition here.
The question that becomes clear after the first half of this debate is two things. One, should we care for our elderly or just, not care for them, leave them to be whatever they be as a society? And two, if we should care for them, what is the best way to do so? Should the state do it and we have no filial connection, or should we believe that individuals should have individual responsibility to their elders, and that should guide some of the care we give, along with state care? Because we haven't said that we should have zero welfare on our side. We think that, obviously, we should care for our elders and we should have this sort of filial bond. Going into that, I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, why the family unit provides unique benefits to the care of the elderly. Secondly, why who will take care of the elderly will be better off distributed in this specific way. Thirdly, why the debt to parents and the duty thus that comes from that is quite important and of value that will rebut what opposition has talked about. Before that, some points of rebuttal. So first of all, they're saying they can't opt out of the system. Well, that's patently false. They can commit suicide. Even if that cost is high, how many people actually consider suicide all the time? We think the majority of the people are quite happy with their lives. And such, if they are to be blamed for their suffering, they also should get credit for their joys, right? Because there's no scenario on their side that a kid can exist without their parents also existing, having given birth to them. So they have to give that. Secondly, they're saying, like, look, you're saying that love can't be touched, but society can promote norms of, being bonding with your family or not. Like we've seen, several societies historically have said that you should not have a filial connection or a parental connection. You should denounce your parents if they're wrong for society and go, to the glory of the state instead. We think that that is the wrong way to go, and that we should be in favor of that more and more substantial. Secondly, it's saying you can't legally codify love, but you can legally codify things that, express certain expectations of norms, right? That's why we legally codify responsibility of parents towards children, because we can't make them love them, but we can make them care for them, and in the consequence have that expectation that they should love them, should care for them, which provides the norms we care about. Also, they're saying, like, look, they didn't consent to this obligation to care for the parents. Well, this is bullshit. You're born into society, you have tons of obligations you didn't consent to, but somebody has to care for the elderly. Whether it's a tax dollar or you personally, you still have to care for them, right? Even if you consent to or not, the state's going to force you to, right? So, also beyond that, saying it's an arbitrary connection. That's also bullshit. It's not an arbitrary connection. They are your parents. They gave birth to you. They're the reason for your existence. Just like your parents to you is not an arbitrary connection. They chose to have you. They chose to create a progeny with you. And thus, we don't think that connection at all is arbitrary, which is why every society in the world has had a specific bond between parents and kids. And yes, sometimes teacher might be better parents than the actual biological parents, or the aunt might be a better father figure or whatever. But we're saying here that in most cases that is not so, and that's why we believe that in most cases this is specific. And then they're saying, like, oh, but they'll be viewed as leeches. but they're more likely to be viewed as leeches, or in the more beneficial case, the parent themselves seeing themselves as a burden. If we don't have a norm that the child has any duty towards the parent, that's when the parent will feel like I'm just leeching off the kid, or the kid itself thinking, I have no connection here, this person's just leeching off me. If we promote the norm that you actually have a connection and a duty, and it falls upon you to do this, then you won't have the idea of them leeching, but you actually paying your respect and paying your due. I'll take a second.
So your case actually argues for symmetry, like my parents have taken care of me, therefore I need to take care of my parents. Under the status quo, in the vast majority of countries, parents have the right to abort children if they do not want them. Why shouldn't symmetry work in both ways? Why shouldn't kids have the right to abort their parents if they do not want them?
First of all, in no society I can think of do the father have a right to abortion of the kid, so that falls flat on half the parents. Secondly, we don't necessarily think that's true. You're not allowed to abort the kid after it's born, right? So that is a distinction that you also have to deal with. But what we're saying is also the last thing here, that, oh, the parent can act like crap and still expect a payout. What problem is, when we're pushing a norm that you should care about your family, it'll be less likely for them to act like crap. And we don't think it's really a realistic scenario that the parent will make that sort of economic calculus and say, like, oh, I'll just act like a dick to my kid and get a payout anyways. We don't think that's how families work. So, and lastly, they talk about absolves the state. I'll get into that in my first point, right? So, look, why is the family unit providing specific and unique benefits? Well, first of all, it's not just a monetary guarantee of we'll help you out even when the state won't do so. But it's more that it'll socially help you out, socially be there for you. You are not alone and you will not be abandoned. That is something that is of dramatic importance to two kinds of people. First of all, children who are new to this world. Everything is strange, dangerous, and scary. To know that your parents are there for you, they will not abandon you, and they will not let you be alone, even though, of course, existentially, we are all alone. But to feel that they are still there for you, and to have that bond, is a measure of security that cannot be provided by the government, for example. Likewise, at the end of your life, your lover is dead. Your friends are dead. The only thing you have that is there that won't leave you, that won't abandon you, is your child that has that unique bond with you, can provide you with a sense that I have a reason to live on. I'm not alone in this universe, even though I'm heading towards my death, in such a way that the state cannot provide you. So we're saying that that is something that is unique to the family unit. So who then will take care of the elderly? Well, they on their side say the state will do so, because they, they say that it's better that one person, like, and I'll take, well, it's too late, I suppose, no bad, but, one person, a coordinator, a head officer, take care of 600 elderly people and see to their needs, is more efficient on their side if the state does it. We don't think that's true. We think it's much more efficient if it's a more one-to-one ratio, which is not exactly true, but closer to truth when it's every kid cares for their parent, right? But that doesn't mean the state shouldn't exist, but for most cases like that. Just like the state will take care of the people who fall between the cracks for children, they could do the same in the opposite direction, right? But secondly, if it should be a one-to-one ratio, if that leads to their needs being more fulfilled, more taken care of, because it's more attention given to you by that one person, right? Who should it be? Well, it's better for the person who has a blood connection, right? They care more, they know more about them, and because they have this filial bond, will be more likely to care for them and their needs. So thirdly then, why is then this debt an important thing? Well, because the parents have invested a lot, but because it's about outcome. It's not necessarily about decision, right? Even if the kid is born without a decision made, it still has to be cared for. Same principle goes here. The elderly are there, they need care for, so there's a duty. And that's the reason why we propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the member to deliver his 7-minute address here.
Dear panels, 2 points in my speech. Firstly, why children should not have the obligation towards, on the moral level, should not have the obligation towards their parents, or if you will, why children have the right to abort their parents. Secondly, why it does lead to why this sort of policy does lead to the state simply throwing off its responsibility, building further on some claims that we already heard in the top half. Let's talk, before that, 2 points of rebuttal. First, both to the entire government bench, they confuse laws with norms. They maintain that the only way in which we can create a norm, a societal norm, a positive one, is through legislation. We simply dispute that. We say that, that you can, for example, encourage people to do all these things. You can explain about the importance. You can have advertisement campaigns. You can have politicians talking about this. All these things are great, and all these things, in order to strengthen bonds between parents and their children, all these sorts of things we're very happy with. Simply, that doesn't meet the threshold of why we need legislation specifically in order to do that. Secondly, they have this premise saying that you legislate in order to give people psychological comfort. That is absurd. If that were true, we would, for example, perhaps ban divorce because of the psychological harms they can accrue to children. We say that, that the state, that your own psychological well-being is simply not an issue that legislation should deal with, and should deal with definitely not when it comes to coercing people in order to make someone else feel slightly better. Secondly, they note that, about CG specifically, when they're talking to us about the familial unit and the need to feel that your family is there, we simply don't understand how this happens under OG's mechanism when they send a check at the end of the month. How does that make you feel that the family is there for you, unless you're adding another sort of commitment, which we will explain, and if you are, we'll explain why that's terrible in my first point, which I'm going into right now. Why do you have a right? Why do you not have this sort of obligation? Because basically, we get one major point from that side on the issue of commitment. They tell us the children have, please be a bit more quiet, the children have given treatment to the child, therefore from that derives some reciprocity and the obligation of the child to do the same. Firstly, note, and OO already mentioned this, the parents chose to do this, and they receive something in return. They receive love. They receive the notion that they have someone to care for. They have made that conscious decision, and there isn't a symmetry here because the child didn't make the same choice. But on a deeper level, we're saying that there is a huge binding commitment that you're placing upon these parents, upon these children now, towards their parents. Because first of all, you have a financial burden throughout your entire life. When they're talking about you give a percentage of your salary each month, this actually means, for example, it ties you into a job. Oftentimes, just like we see with, for example, paying child support to a father paying child support. Yes, this impacts his economic well-being. This impacts your ability to, for example, take time off your job to educate yourself and for professional education and so on. Secondly, we say it's a unique burden on couples. Specifically in most Western liberal democracies where you have rather small number of children per couple, you're often likely to see a situation in which two people have to treat two pairs of parents. One household has to treat financially two sets of parents all the time. We're saying this is a huge economic burden. We're also saying this is often mutually exclusive with their ability to give the best care to their children. And their children, we say, have the need for that much more. You have much more of an obligation towards them because they didn't choose this, because they're in a more helpless position. Now we're saying this, yes, this binds them in a very significant way. Why is this critical? Because we note that parents today have the ability not to take care of a child if that binds them to a large extent. First of all, yes, the notion of abortion. The notion that we can do something that for some people in society is perceived as taking a life, just in order not to be financially bound for your entire life by having that child. But also we have the option of adoption. You can actually give your child away if you feel you're not able to take care of it, or if the burden is too great for you in order to do that. We're saying that is an option that exists. Obviously, if it exists for parents with a child that they chose to have, and it exists with a child that is helpless, Obviously, the same thing should apply to a parent, to a child choosing to opt out of taking care for his parent, a decision he has not himself actually made. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Okay, you can't make the same parallel between the two because necessarily not giving up your child for adoption incurs like huge personal attention to that, as opposed to simply giving away, financing your parents' well-being.
Thank you. No, we're saying first of all, obviously, as we just explained, there is a huge commitment deriving from the notion that they have to give money every month. In terms of how I'm able to run my family, the way I'm able to work, the way I'm able to take care of my own children. We're saying all these are critical issues in which I have a unique commitment. But let's talk about the state and why it actually sheds its responsibility through this policy. Because opening government basically come up and tell us that we need to invest less now in rich parents. We don't have to spread the blanket as far. We're saying, first of all, under status quo, you don't do that today. Meaning, the state only supports those parents who actually have a concrete need and who don't have that sort of care provided to them. Now, opening opposition talk to us about the damages from the state actually shedding its responsibility. What the government say is this is not actually mutually exclusive. Two things here which make it mutually exclusive. First of all, we're saying that legislation, as they point out constantly, does create a certain norm. We're saying it's not necessary to create a norm, but it certainly does. The notion that there is a law that says someone else has that responsibility means they're much less likely to say as a voter, as a taxpayer, I should be paying for those parents. We're saying moreover that specifically the rich people who tend to influence policy more feel they are actually doubly taxed under this policy, meaning they provide for their own parents. They are obligated by the state to do that, but they are also obligated to support everybody else's parents. Note this is critical when these people are able to lobby policy, and they are actually critical in the way the state actually makes those decisions. Now, CG says, but the state is actually less efficient than the familial cells in bringing that treatment. We're saying no. The reason for that is that you're creating inequality. Specifically, the people who are most in need, as opening government tells us, are likely to have children who are not really able to support them, not to the extent that they need, and definitely get worse standards from the state because of that. For all those reasons, extremely proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the government to conclude the speeches from side proposition today.
Thank you for the floor. I'm going to summarize this on 3 points. Firstly, whether you have no obligation to your parents. Secondly, whether closing family ties are good. And thirdly, what provides the best service for the elderly. First, some points of rebuttal. So, closing opposition keeps bringing up abortion. And I mean, obviously we allow abortion because we define fetuses as not people. That's why you can do abortion. All people are people, so there's no analogy. Secondly, they seem to like, at the end of the speech, actually concede the idea quite explicitly that laws does affect morals, and there is a normative effect by legislation on people's norms and morality. So I don't know if I need this point of rebuttal anymore, but I'm still going to point out, in a country like our country, Sweden, for example, where laws don't promote very much family values and family economic ties, more individualism instead, you do have much weaker family ties. I don't even know who my parents are right now. My sister got married without telling me. It's sad, but it happens in those countries. Thirdly, they said, oh my God, you're going to have to take care of 2 parents, and you're going to be a lone child. And we said, if each generation is half the size of the old one, we have other problems than this motion, right? On average, it's probably not going to be the case long term, otherwise humanity would expire. Fourthly, they say you can do adoptions, that should be similar. Again, you can't just adopt away your kids, right? I can't drop them on the street and say, oh, someone should adopt them. You have to actually find someone to adopt them, otherwise you're still responsible for them. Similarly, so they want to tweak the mech into saying that if someone wants to take over your parents because, I don't know, they love taking care of old people, maybe you can, we don't see that's important to this debate. Last point of rebuttal. So they say like, you know, the law shouldn't take like psychology into consideration. And we say like all their harms that are psychological then seem to like not be things that should be considered in this debate. So they need to sort that out for themselves. Okay. So first clash point. Do you have an obligation to your parents? So both sides agree, right? The parents who haven't abused their kids have invested a lot of money, time and energy to the best of their knowledge to make like, you know, to make their kids who they are and like make them good people, right? So opposition tells us that you inflict suffering on the kid. Well, first of all here, like, so things like, you know, religion or whatever are fundamentally benign things from the parent's point of view and not things you can really prove to be bad, right? Like making someone, I don't know, eat halal or like, you know, belonging to a community doesn't seem like things you can objectively say are bad things for the kid. Like it just seems like, you know, from the parent's point of view, they're good and we can't really like, you know, for sure judge otherwise. Then we get a lot of this stuff about consent. So you already told me, right, so a parent may not actually have consent to the situation in the first place either, right? If I impregnate someone, I want the woman to have an abortion, but she doesn't want to, I'll have a kid that I did not consent to having. This can happen to quite a lot of people, right? But also beyond that, we say like, you know, lack of consent, like in general, right, doesn't really free you from obligation. So if I walk past someone who's drowning, I didn't consent to be there while they drown, but doesn't really like free me from the obligation to maybe help them. Like moral obligations aren't really contingent upon whether you consented to be in the situation that you are or not. Then we say like similarly, even if I gain, so they give us this stuff like, oh, I get all this love back, and, you know, etc., etc. The fact that you gain from a situation, again, doesn't at all, on any principle level, free you from an obligation, right? Like, if I do something that benefits you a lot, you might be, like, you know, obliged to pay me back or do something for me, even if I got enjoyment out of it. Like, that doesn't really, like, free you in any way. Finally, as my sort of PY tried to highlight, right, there isn't an other version of you that, you know, is better off where your parents didn't have you. Like, we really like opposition to characterize this sort of autonomous me that existed if my parents did not have me. We see that that's like a very weird kind of comparative for them to put out, right? It's this life or nothing. So, as sort of the opposition admitted when I made that PY, most people prefer living. Most people like, you know, existence, even if there's some suffering, some bad things, that's what people choose, by the virtue that they continue to exist in that life. Given that, it doesn't really make sense to say, oh, I hate my parents because they made me exist. Like, you know, obviously you think that existence is probably pretty decent, so like, and there's no other existence that would be better that you could have without your parents actually having you in the first place. I'll take over.
Great, so if I save a homeless person from drowning, or I give somebody on the street $10, do they then have an obligation to give me back that money or to save me in the future?
Here.
No, not every action where you do something for someone obliges that person. Like, that's not generally true. What we're saying in this case is you're giving up a lot of time and money and resources to create this person, and that creates some kind of obligation to give some of it back, right? Okay, so is promoting family ties good? Second clash point. So opening your opposition, things you're within the state duty, and sort of promote like procreation and family love and so on. So we say like state codifies morality, right? As op continuously seem to have actually conceived. So we're saying that given that you won't probably resent it, like once this is in place, you will see it's quite natural you support your parents. You won't see it as something strange. It will be like a very, very natural thing. And then we give you some quite important material. So firstly, we say like we do want people to have kids, right, to stay in our existence. So promoting the idea of like, you know, procreation is a nice thing and love for your children is a good thing. It's probably generally like a good thing for the existence of the human race. But secondly, we say that the family unit is really learning a lot of things like coordination, consideration, to not be egoistical. It's something you can then like extend to the rest of society. It's something that like is an important building block. And thirdly, it provides community. Like, you know, as Johan told you, like, you know, as we all face the existential dread, this is something that makes it a little bit more palatable to live with, right? And then if you have less absentee fathers, you know, stronger like your perceptions of these sort of family bonds, that is generally a quite good thing. As you stare into the abyss, you can shoot a sideways glance at your kids every now and then and feel a little bit better about yourself. Thirdly then, what provides good service for the elderly? So, mech-wise we can play around with a lot of, you know, tinkering here and there on both sides as to how we have taxes, how we, you know, create, you know, deal with socioeconomic differences, etc. What Johan told you are a couple of unique benefits that we get from this motion specifically, right? So first of all, you have a different focus. In the government bureaucracy, you have responsibility for a lot of people who are all just kind of faceless names to you that you don't really have any connection to. In this case, you have a very specific responsibility to someone you know well, that you just sort of know, right? So you have much more of a focus, much less likely that, you know, someone gets forgotten, that, you know, you didn't realize that this person needed this new medication, etc., because you're on that case completely the one thing that you're caring about, then that makes it for much better care. Secondly, we said that you know your parents quite well, right? You know their needs, you can be there socially, you're much more likely to give them better care. This is specifically important for one of the most vulnerable groups, which are like old people who are senile or have dementia, or for very few reasons can't really express their preferences very well anymore. We said that these people's children are much more likely to know their preferences anyway, much more so than government bureaucrats or just some kind of elderly care nurses that don't know these things. And finally, we said that if people care more for parents, we have much more pressure on government to provide for the old in the first place, right? So when they talk about how we're going to spend tax money on these, the state responsibility, they say it's much more likely to invest a lot in this if people in general care a lot for their parents and care about the elderly homes they're in and want to help them more. So we think we create more political capital to affect all these things on our side as well. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the opposition to conclude tonight's debate. Xavier.
Let's be clear. From the open government, we get a case that people are going to abuse the elderly, that systems are failing, that some people are miserable, and from the closing government, we get an extension to say that just the familial ties are unique, and we must preserve them in society. The open opposition tells you, but listen, they are going to be perceived as leeches, and no consent can occur. This debate, as pointed out from POIs and from the state of the opposition line, happens in a very specific place. It happens in a place in which the children themselves do not want to help their parents. And this is a sentence to underline while judging this debate, because it makes the vast majority of the case from the closing government irrelevant to this debate. Note. A couple of questions to ask. Firstly, why family ties and the case of the closing government is not a part of this debate. Secondly, a case that will bring you off why specifically it's actually going to weaken the support of the state. Now, the open opposition tell you that now there's going to be no incentive for improvement. We take it one step further and tell you that now there's going to be an incentive to actually downgrade the amount of support that the state is going to provide and actually harm the vast majority of the people. And thirdly, the principle, or if you prefer, why I have a right to adopt my parents and to give them to the state. Let's start with the unique care that closing government gives us at the core of their extension. A, note, there is a fallacy in the heart of the case saying that a good thing necessarily should be a legal thing. The fact that I'm going to say hello to each and every one of you in the morning is a good thing. However, it doesn't constitute a legal obligation. They do not meet the burden to explain us why it's going to be in that case. Secondly, by the mechanism that was given by the open government, that was PI twice by us, the only care that we're going to give is sending money. Gustav, if all you're going to do now is to send money to your parents back in Sweden, it doesn't mean that you're actually going to get the familial ties that you yourself advocate under the model. So we just don't accept that the positive things that the closing government actually aim for are going to be achieved. Thirdly, note, the motion is meaningless for rich people, specifically by the definition. Why? Because rich people are going to view the additional money that they're going to get from their children as marginal. Also the case for people who come from the middle class, right? Having another $1,000 a month is not something that is going to move me from being completely impoverished to have a good life after all. Why does it matter? Because specifically in the places of children who live, or of people who live in poverty, it will come on the harm of not giving enough money to my children, who are more dependent on me and who are under our side of the house. It is something that you actually can constitute to be a replacement to something that I want, therefore harm my own autonomy. I'm going to use it in a second to tell you why, in principle, from the same logic that we can give our children to adoption or abort them in some cases, the harm to self-autonomy is something that is going to be a valid principle to judge this debate as well. Moreover, they tell you, but it's just the government is going to be not as good in some cases. In the vast majority of the cases, it's not going to be mutually exclusive. Actually, it's going to be more mutually exclusive on your side of the house. I'm going to tell you in a second. But we just don't accept that premise as well, because bureaucrats have seen thousands of cases, specifically cases of people who are mentally ill. So in the vast majority of cases, they're actually better in taking care of them and know what are the conditions, and as give you. If you want to create a norm, you can incentivize to do it in many other cases, right? Create the norms, let politicians talk about it. And right now, societal already have a huge value on family values in the vast majority of places. CGM. So let's talk about the state welfare, because in the last minute they also had the idea that right now, because a lot of people are going to take care of their children, therefore there is going to be an incentive to reform the system by and large. As shown in the first place, it's not going to actually get to these changes, right? Because in the vast majority of the cases, either people already want to do it, or they're just going to send money for their parents if they really don't want to do it. We just don't accept the change. But moreover, we can agree to the fact that it can create a new norm. We're saying, I think that was not rebutted, that a norm is going to be a bad one. How come? Because you're going to create the idea right now of the state. I have the right to support my own parents, but not everyone else's parents. And this is a line to underline in this debate. How come? Because if I believe, as a part of the richer classes of society, that I have a right to take care of my own parents, but this is something which is mutually exclusive of the state, quoting the DPM in this debate, saying that this is going to be the first care, that the narrative that we want is that children are going to be responsible for their parents rather than the state. I'm quoting her directly here. Now, there is going to be less of a chance to putting more money in the welfare systems for everyone. Why does it matter? Because for the children who are actually dependent on the state itself, the status quo in the vast majority of cases that are going to get money both from their children and from the state. This is the normal in most families right now. If you're going to call your children, if you have cancer, most children are going to give money for their parents. It matters now because if the state is not going to be a proper security net and they're going to diminish that, even if children will want to help their parents, because the rich will not want to be as invested in the system as the poor people, there is going to be less money in the system by and large. Thus, the coercion and everything bad that they say is actually flipped on its side first.
So there's less people dependent on the system, so you're going to be able to free up money. But look, your extension is on economic burden. So if that's the case, that argument is literally against any form of tax that, by the way, you also don't.
I'm going to differentiate in a second. However, not less people are going to depend on the system. Only the poor are dependent on the welfare system. These are people that are still going to be dependent just with less political capital from richer parts of society in order to do the reforms that you yourself want to achieve. Principle, why do I have the right to give up my parents for adoption? The analogy here. Firstly, note, the entire case of the government is predicated upon the idea that parents are likely to be in bad shape. This is something which is a bit weird, and here's the differentiation that they want in a POI. Most of them do have pensions, most of them do have reserves. The vast majority of the society is not going to be completely dependent. Secondly, they concede that if I abused or neglected my own children, I should not have this kind of obligation. However, the vast majority of abuses and negligence is something that you cannot codify in a legal law. If I'm a parent that have told his child that because he's gay, he doesn't deserve my love, this is not an abuse that the law can find. However, this is an abuse in which many parents have committed, unfortunately, against their children, which means that in the cases in which the motion carries weight, is cases in which a child does not want to support their parents in a case of misery. These are exactly the cases in which you cannot codify by law. However, you can do it on a case-by-case basis because, quoting closing government, children know the relationship with the family is their best. But moreover, we tell you there is a degree of autonomy which you should constitute in this debate. Why? Because the following thing. We recognize a right to abortion to some extent. Agreed that not after the child was born, this is the case of adoption. Why do we do that? We do that because in many cases, the autonomy of the current living should be prioritized over the rights of others, and we take it into consideration into the status quo. In the cases here, as we tell you in that extension, there is a fact that my own children will need my support and it's going to be mutually exclusive if I will not want to give money for my parents in the vast majority of cases. The fact that I'm going to have to support two people are going to have to support four people in many cases. It's not the case that humanity is dying out, but it doesn't matter in the short term that we're going to harm the cases of many people. It's just something which is the exact same logic that I'm going to be able to take out my ties. Because we just can accept most of the case and just not related, because the state is going to be diminished as a means of welfare, and because on principle, this is something that you do not believe in, you must oppose.
We thank all speakers for their remarks. I ask you guys to please shake hands, leave the room. We are in here, panel A, and you guys are out in the other room. I don't know what the room number is.
All right.
I'm useless.
All right, we'll figure that out. Thank you for watching round 2 of the HWS round robin in room 204.